My name is Morris Williams, and it is my privilege to welcome you, to encourage you to buy a copy of Steve Coll's new book, Directorate S, the CIA and America's Secret Wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm Philadelphia welcome to Stephen Coll.
Thank you all for coming out here. Really good to see you. I will try to move briskly through my part of the show so we can hear questions from you as well. I'm kind of a rookie college professor these days, and one thing I've learned is it's always good to have pictures to look at least with this generation of students. So there's one. That's a picture from February 15th, 1989, and it's the final armored column of the limited contingent of Soviet forces in Afghanistan, as the Soviet occupying army called itself. It's a bunch of armored personnel carriers crossing the Amu Darya River, and it was a maneuver that officially ended Soviet combat operations in the Afghan war. The last commanding general, a guy named Boris Gromov, dramatically rode in the last of these armored personnel carriers and got down and then walked across the bridge without looking back at Afghanistan, and his teenage son greeted him with a bouquet of flowers. So that was the end of the Soviet war. In late December 2014, President Obama announced the responsible end of U.S. combat operations in Afghanistan, and they staged a ceremony. There was a General Campbell, who was running the war at that time, and he thought about this scene, and he wondered what he should do. And there was a lot of security problems outside of the headquarters of the American military base in Kabul, and he wasn't really ready to invite the Taliban to attack this ceremony. So they decided to organize it in a gymnasium, in a basketball gym. And they invited Afghan cabinet members and allies from NATO countries. And they handed out a program for the ceremony, and it had instructions about how to get down and lie flat on the ground in the event of a rocket attack. So maybe not the most auspicious end of a war. And that also signaled that, in fact, it wasn't, in the end, an ending. So today, we are still fighting two wars in Afghanistan, actually. A year after that ceremony, where they handed over combat operations to Afghan forces, the Obama administration actually went back to war in Afghanistan directly against the Islamic State. There was a branch of the Islamic State that kind of popped up in eastern Afghanistan. And then, in addition to that combat, that line of action, we are also fighting what is known as an advise and assist war to the Afghan security forces, where we essentially provide their air force and support on the ground for their commandos and military. So more than 2,000 American soldiers have died in these 17 years. 20,000 have been wounded. Hundreds more contractors, aid workers. Some researchers at Brown University tried to add up all the deaths in Afghanistan since 2001. They count about 140,000. And so this story, this book, is an attempt to provide, kind of under the surface, a history of how we got from 2001, September 11th, to the stalemate that we're in now, with no end in sight. And it's a narrative history. I was glad that there was a little scene and dialogue highlighted in the introduction, because I try to tell this as a story that's accessible and full, without kind of scrimping on the context and the ideas. And it's a very complicated history that unfolds in 4 sections in the book. The first is about the war we fought in the fall of 2001 in retaliation for the September 11 attacks. The second section is called Losing the Peace, and it covers the years from 2002 to 2006, where we squandered an opportunity to stabilize Afghanistan after throwing the Taliban out. The third is called The Best Intentions, which describes the years from 2006 to 2009, when both the Bush administration and the incoming Obama administration decided that it was time to turn attention back to Afghanistan and to al-Qaeda after the troubles in Iraq. And the final section is called The End of Illusion and covers the years from 2010 to the present, essentially, where the Obama administration, now the Trump administration, has confronted the intractability of a lot of this conflict, but also lost their idealism about it, and that's part of where we are. So Directorate S refers to something specific. I don't know how many of you have any idea what that is. Does anyone, hands in the air, have any idea what that is? 3 or 4 people? Okay, it's good. I'm glad I'm going to explain this. So it refers to the covert action arm, the secret action arm of the Pakistani Intelligence Service, ISI. It's the group inside the Pakistani Intelligence Service that has run guns and money to radical Islamist militias in the region, including the Taliban. We know all about them because the CIA collaborated with this group during the 1980s to run the arms and money to the Afghan Mujahideen when they were fighting the 40th Army. We left Afghanistan, and ISI and Directorate S continued this policy that they'd kind of discovered in collaboration with us, that they could hold their main rival, the country they are mainly worried about, India, off balance by funding these radical Islamist militias, both to influence politics in Afghanistan and also to occasionally pursue their goals in Kashmir or to just unsettle India. So that's what Directorate S is. It proved to be one of the most difficult problems in the American war because the Taliban, as they came back, took sanctuary in Pakistan and renewed the relationship with ISI and Directorate S that they had enjoyed when they were in power in Afghanistan during the 1990s. And across 3 administrations, the United States has not been able to figure out what to do about this problem, to change Pakistan's conduct or to stop ISI from aiding the Taliban. And that's one of the biggest reasons why the war has been a stalemate. There's a scene from 2011 in the CIA station in Kabul where the station chief is a long-serving officer, a guy named Chris Wood, congressional visitors come in and they all get to spend an hour with him, and he gives them a basic sense of how the war is going or not going. And he says to all of them, we either address the sanctuary the Taliban enjoys in Pakistan and we win the war, or we don't and we lose the war. It's that simple. Now, you can argue about how complex or simple that problem was, but there's no question that the failure to change ISI and Directorate S's conduct during the war confused many of the Afghans that we were trying to bring along on our project of reconstruction. So what I want to do with my time is to give you a sense of why we failed, in addition to this problem I've just outlined, why we failed to achieve our goals in Afghanistan, and why are we still there? And I want to talk about that in reference to sort of 4 problems. First, the problem of our war aims in Afghanistan. The second is the failure of our relationship with Hamid Karzai and our investments in democratic Afghan politics more broadly. Thirdly, the illusions of our counterinsurgency war in Afghanistan. And finally, the failure of political and diplomatic strategy. So let's start with war aims. I had covered this conflict as a kind of beat reporter at various stages of my career for The New Yorker and otherwise, and I felt like I had a basic sense of how decisions had been made. But when I went back to really excavate the decision-making and to try to get underneath the surface, I discovered that there had been more than a dozen classified strategy reviews about the Afghan war across the Bush and Obama administration. And sort of amusingly, from a reporter's point of view, they all took place, almost all of them took place in the same classified conference room on the 4th floor of the Eisenhower Executive Office building next door to the West Wing. And when you would interview people, the cast would rotate, but the conversation, the discussion, and the process of making strategy or renewing strategy would be quite repetitious. And at the heart of that repetition was the problem of answering the question, why are we there? Why are we fighting this war? It started in 2006, these discussions, and then They were renewed in 2008, in 2009, 2010. And one of the problems was to identify the kinds of vital interests. It's kind of a cliche of national security bureaucracy, but it's an important idea. The kinds of vital interests that would justify sending young American men and women to combat. Like, what's really important enough to justify that? And in 2009, during the two separate Obama administration reviews, the groups in these classified rooms identified two vital interests. One was al-Qaeda, which was still active in carrying out international attacks, still present on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And the second was the security of Pakistan's nuclear weapons, because there was a concern that if those fell into the wrong hands, you could have a real catastrophe. But think about it. In 2009, neither of those problems was actually located in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda had fled Afghanistan for Pakistan in the fall of 2001 and had embedded there along the border and in Pakistani cities. And of course, Pakistan's nuclear weapons are in Pakistan. So then they moved on to the question, well, if the vital interests that we're going to war for are in Pakistan, why are we sending tens of thousands of American troops to Afghanistan? This raised the problem that's been present in the war from the very first weeks that the Bush administration conceived the retaliation after 9/11, which is, are the Taliban really our enemy? Are we fighting a war against the Taliban? The official way we would put it is we're fighting a war against al-Qaeda and its affiliates. So they'd go into these conference rooms and they'd argue about, is the Taliban an affiliate of al-Qaeda? Well, there were no Afghans on those planes. It's not even clear the Taliban leadership knew about the September 11th attacks. You could say they were legally or morally culpable for the attacks because they had provided sanctuary to al-Qaeda during the years that al-Qaeda planned them. And yet, they had never launched or declared an intention to launch attacks outside of Afghanistan. They explained that the reason they were fighting us was because we had come into their country with an occupying army and they wanted us to go home. So they would get into these rooms and argue about this question, and President Obama was very clear that he did not want to fight a long war against the Taliban. He didn't think it was winnable at any acceptable cost or on any acceptable timeline. And he had allies at the table, even Bob Gates, the holdover defense secretary from the Bush administration, said at one of these meetings, you know, the Taliban are part of Afghanistan. We're not going to root them out through military action with an army that travels all the way from the United States. But the Pentagon felt strongly that we had to fight the Taliban in order to stabilize Afghanistan, in order to build up Afghan security forces to take the war so that we didn't have to fight it. And there's one scene where they get into an argument about the people on the White House side are saying, well, have we ever really said that we're going to defeat the Taliban? And I think we've never really made that promise. Maybe we can just find some other words to go to war on. And the Pentagon goes away. They come back the next day with a big PowerPoint deck that has all of the public statements that American presidents and senators have made promising to defeat the Taliban over the years. And they say, well, you may not want to fight this war, but you keep saying you're going to win it. In the end, they chose to define the purpose of the war as to degrade the Taliban and reverse its momentum. So that's pretty loose, subjective language to send young men and women to war for. If you were to put the best spin on it, you would say that it was an effort to hand off the war to the Afghan forces, who should have been built up long before 2009 but weren't ready, and that it was necessary to essentially adopt this vague and frustrating goal and send people to the jungles of the green zone outside of Kandahar to fight and die in order to buy this interval of time. And if you watch the Ken Burns documentary about another war, that might sound familiar. Hamid Karzai. So it became fashionable at a certain point to think of Hamid Karzai as unstable, moody. There's no question that his behavior in private was often unbalanced, as the book describes again and again. But why did Karzai come to doubt the intentions of the United States and Britain so deeply? One reason was he could not understand why the United States accommodated Directorate S and ISI as it provided sanctuary and support to the Taliban when they revived. Karzai took it for granted that the United States was the world's most powerful country, and if it really wanted ISI to change what it was doing, that it could achieve that result. And then year after year, we didn't achieve that result, and he became confused. You know, again, I was a beat reporter on the war. I would go out, and I've interviewed Karzai a couple of times. I've seen him at press conferences a bunch of times. I thought I understood more or less where he was coming from, but when I went back for the book and really excavated as many of the meetings that he had with Americans at critical turning points as I could find, found notes and records and interviewed participants, I was really surprised by something, which was that every time an American official came to visit Hamid Karzai in his kind of benign house arrest prison of the Arg Palace in central Kabul, Karzai would open the meeting by saying, "You've got to do more about Pakistan. You've got to do more about ISI. The Taliban are really a problem that emanates across the border." And there's a scene where then candidate Obama, as a senator, visits Afghanistan for the first time, and he comes to meet Karzai and his cabinet. And the cabinet, they all are fighting with each other. They're very divided. But they have a meeting beforehand, and they say, okay, let's get organized. This guy could be president of the United States. Let's present a unified front. Everyone's going to go around the table and speak. Everyone gets 2 minutes to say something to him. We should all say, what about Directorate S? What about Directorate S? That's what they did. Obama asked a few questions. And so when we failed to do anything about this problem, Karzai said to himself, well, there must be another explanation. And he thought, well, maybe it's that the United States wants Pakistan to destabilize Afghanistan in order to justify keeping military bases in the country. This became a very frustrating conspiracy theory for the Americans to hear, and it became a big reason why Karzai was so uncooperative in almost every negotiation we carried out. Finally, there's a scene where this special envoy to Afghanistan, a guy named James Dobbins, goes over to see Karzai at a critical moment to try to get him off this idea. And he says to him, you know, Mr. President, by now you have the Snowden materials, you have millions of cables from WikiLeaks. Can you see in any of these documents any trace of the design that you're imagining? And Karzai kind of says half-jokingly, maybe you don't know about the plan. And then he refers to there being a deep state in the United States. So the quote at the beginning in the introduction is another reason why he was so confused. When Biden says to him, Mr. President, Pakistan is 50 times more important to the United States than Afghanistan, what does he mean? How could that be true? We're sending tens of thousands of soldiers to that war, incurring civilian casualties. Even Biden's own son is going to combat in Afghanistan. How can his father say that Pakistan is 50 times more important than Afghanistan? Well, Pakistan does have nuclear weapons. It does have a population 10 times as large as Afghanistan's. But what's really going on in that scene is something else, which is that when the Obama administration came in, they decided that the Bush administration had coddled Hamid Karzai, that they had treated him with kid gloves. They had twice weekly or bi-monthly video conferences with him and really kept him on side. And he had cooperated in response to that attention. The Obama team felt like what this had done was enabled Karzai's corruption, his fecklessness, his lack of engagement as a leader of the war. And so they decided that they were going to send him a different message. In fact, in the spring of 2009, running up to the big presidential election of that year, Richard Holbrooke, who was the first special envoy that Obama appointed to try to resolve the politics of the war, he decided, without any particular White House authorization that I can find, but under a theory of diplomacy as jazz improvisation, he started letting it be known that he wanted to encourage people to run against Karzai. And of course, everyone that he talked to about this, everyone in Karzai's cabinet, immediately went to the president and said, you know, this guy's coming around telling me to run against you. Don't think that I intend to do that. I want to keep my job, boss. So it was not a secret what he was doing. One time Holbrooke comes to Kabul during this effort to try to figure out how to replace Karzai, and he runs into a semi-credible candidate, a brother of the commander, Ahmad Shah Massoud, named Ahmad Zia Massoud. And Ahmad Zia says to him, Richard, I think I am the only plausible candidate in Kabul who you have not encouraged to run against Hamid Karzai. And I'm kind of insulted. I mean, I thought we were friends. So then we have this election in 2009, which turns into a constitutional crisis. It gets resolved with John Kerry, whispering in Karzai's ear as they walk around the garden. Kerry tells him, I had an election that was very close myself. I had to go ahead and accept the result I didn't like. You should too. And so we ended up getting the worst of both possible worlds. We had Karzai back in power for 5 years, persuaded with reason that the United States was out to get him and that they wanted to throw him out of office. And between that and his confusion about ISI, it's really no mystery why he became alienated from the United States. And to just attribute that to his being moody or unreliable is, kind of a falsifying and sort of self-deceiving way of thinking about what really happened. Of course, the other contradiction in our relationship with him was that we kept telling him, you're the sovereign president of Afghanistan. We follow your lead. And then he would go into a meeting with the American generals who were fighting the counterinsurgency war, and he would say, okay, I don't like this idea of your going into villages and knocking down doors and going into families' houses and grabbing people and taking them to prisons. I don't like this idea of your just dropping bombs on areas where you don't have a precise understanding of whether there are civilians present. In fact, what I would really like you to do is just keep all your troops on bases, occasionally go out and secure the roads, and let us do the fighting. And they would say, Mr. Sovereign President of Afghanistan, that's not the war we're here to fight. And they would go on and fight their own war. And that would leave him not only angry at the Americans, but also helpless, powerless. There's a scene where he goes for a walk in the palace gardens with one of his ministers, and he says, if we can't run the government, we should bring the Taliban back. And Karzai's young son, Mir Weiss, happened to be with them, and his minister friend says, do you want this boy to grow up under a Taliban regime? I don't want that for my son. And he goes on, Mr. President, yes, I believe the United States was not fair to you, but they brought some good things. We have to take some responsibility, too, for the things that have not gone well. But, yes, they first called you an Afghan Mandela. Now they refer to you as an Afghan Mugabe. It's not fair. But if this government collapses and the Taliban do come back, the U.S. will not be threatened. We will be wiped out. And that was the reality that Karzai knew, that he was dependent on the power that claimed he was not dependent. And so that intensified as time went on. That's Richard Holbrooke. That's President Obama's speech announcing that he was escalating the war at West Point in late 2009. It had the unusual feature of the president announcing a dramatic escalation and commitment of U.S. combat troops to a war, and also announcing the date when the troops would come home, which was a kind of going in and going out signal that he had a rationale for it related to the Democratic Party, related to his increasing skepticism about the Pentagon's counterinsurgency doctrine, but it signaled to ISI and to the Taliban that this was a war they could wait out. Counterinsurgency. So after the surge into Baghdad, led by General Petraeus, which seemed to restore security to that war at a very high cost, but still, there was a kind of bubble in Washington if you passed through it. It was a bubble of faith in counterinsurgency doctrine as the antidote to all of these overseas grinding civil wars that we had involved ourselves in. I mean, it was really a bubble. It was an intellectual bubble, I think, like, Bitcoin. And it had a basis in military history, but to see it as some kind of universal solution to the Afghan war that could just be applied and produce a dramatic result, it was an illusion. And as a practical matter, in counterinsurgency doctrine, as the Obama administration started to try to figure out how to apply it in Afghanistan, they very rapidly ran into a math problem. The typical ratio that's required for counterinsurgency deployment is about 20 soldiers and police to every 1,000 local inhabitants. But that would require as many as 600,000 security forces in Afghanistan, which was a highly unrealistic number. So they narrowed the problem by identifying only 80 key terrain districts out of Afghanistan's approximately 400 administrative districts. And these were places in Taliban country, and they decided, well, we'll fight a fully resourced counterinsurgency war there, and we'll let the rest of the country proceed under a different theory. It was echoes of Vietnam and its forgotten lessons. One of the things about Holbrooke, he often mentioned to President Obama the example of Vietnam, which deeply irritated the president, to the point where the president's staff called over to Hillary Clinton and tell her to tell him to please stop referring to Vietnam in the presence of the president. Now, Holbrooke irritated the White House for lots of reasons. He was kind of self-dramatizing, and he was a big personality and difficult to control. But I was talking to him during these years. He died in December of 2010. I was talking to him these years, and for the book I went back to some of the transcripts. And there's one where he comes out of a session at the White House where he has irritated the president again by referring to Vietnam. And he's mortified. You know, he's upset that he's losing this relationship with his boss because he wants to be Secretary of State. But then he stops and he says, they shouldn't be so scared of history. He was right about that. So the mantra of counterinsurgency was clear, hold, build, transfer, meaning transfer territory, rid of Taliban influence to a legitimate Afghan government and its security forces. But as Sherard Coper-Coles, who was the British ambassador, 2 years of hard experience in Kabul, told Holbrooke in July 2009, Afghan capacity is an illusion. The entire sequence of hold, build, transfer is based on wishful thinking. There was a 3-star general in the White House who'd been there for the Bush second term and for Obama. He was kind of the war czar, a guy named Doug Lute. He's a significant character in the book, very interesting guy. And he puts it this way to Obama around the same time. He says, Mr. President, you can send a battalion of US Marines not only anywhere in Afghanistan, but literally anywhere in the world, and they will clear an area. And as long as you're willing to keep them there, they can hold it. The problem is handing the cleared area to the Afghan government and doing anything with it. But this was the war that we asked so many young men and women to go out and fight on the ground in very difficult terrain. And I just want to read a little something from a chapter of the book where I tried to complement the accounts of how these decisions were being made in Afghanistan and Pakistan and in Washington with a sense of what was happening on the ground. And I, with my researcher, Christina Setkowski, who contributed so much to this work, we found a then lieutenant named Tim Hopper, who had kept a diary of the war that he fought at platoon level to the west of Kandahar during this time, 2010. Now, there's an area that's kind of counterintuitive to the west of Kandahar city, which is more or less a desert city. That's called the Green Zone because it's irrigated, and in the summer, it really becomes dense with foliage. And the main feature of the terrain is that there are all these grape orchards with 10-foot berms that are built around them, and these grape houses that are made out of cement. And then, under local initiative, there's also thick, impenetrable groves, 10 feet tall, of marijuana plants to complement the grapes. It made the famous or infamous terrain of Normandy look like an open desert. And the Taliban had been infested in there for really 4 years by the time this task force turned up that Hopper was in. And they had in place booby traps and IEDs in all these grape walls and in the houses and across every little canal that was part of the irrigation system. There was also a system of irrigation tunnels underneath the ground. It took the Americans a long time to figure out what those were, but they went back hundreds of years, and the Taliban could move around as you would in the subway system underneath this canopy of foliage. And so the war was, they sent this task force out south of Highway 1, to basically just clear the Taliban out, walking into this booby-trapped landscape, thick with foliage. And it was the hardest combat of the entire war, alongside the Marines in Helmand. Those two fights, the rates of casualties are just staggering. I think in Hopper's platoon, the company that he was a part of, in a 6-month tour, 80% of the personnel had to be replaced because of combat deaths, severed limbs, concussions, and other injuries. So this diary, which I use excerpt, it's really a thing of beauty. Marty, I was on the radio this morning, she had found it herself and read some of it out, but I'll just read a little bit of it and then I'll read the kind of context for it very quickly. So we're leaving tonight. We're taking a Chinook up to FOB Jalawar. 4 guys from my platoon went up yesterday. I was on the boardwalk getting some ice cream with Doc and my forward observer when we saw a couple of guys from the 82nd. They came up and asked who we were relieving, and we said we were going to go up the Arghandab. They were telling us about it, and man, I'm not going to lie, but it scares the shit out of me, and it kind of depresses me. They were telling me that it's really bad up there. There's a shitload of IEDs. They travel in a file with a dog team up front and a mine detector. They're still losing guys. He said the Taliban are using kids as spotters, and that when you see them, get down and book it, get ready to go for something to go down. Same thing with the farmers. He also said these guys are not your regular Taliban. They're Pakistani ISI-trained guys, and that they will ambush you and not break contact until American attack helicopters are called in. This is going to be crazy. The tripwires are not only down at the foot or leg level, but head level too. People get so focused on the ground that they forget to look up, so we need to look up as well as look down. The orchards are super thick, and you basically have to bear crawl through them. The number one thing he said was that every operation needs to be incredibly deliberate and take everything slow. Well, I'm going to go relax and enjoy having 2 arms and 2 legs while I still have them. So when you connect that experience of the war to the kind of softness of the goal setting and the language and the sort of indirectness of some of what we were asking to do, it's a frustrating thing. So I want to add something about the failure of our political and diplomatic strategy. I've been on the road for a month on this book. Whenever I put this picture up, I don't always have the photos, but whenever I put it up, I ask, does anyone recognize this guy? I haven't found anyone yet, so. So this is a guy named Tayyib Agha, and he was appointed as the head of the Taliban Political Commission around 2010. And one of the threads in the book's narrative is the secret negotiations that the Obama administration conducted with the Taliban over 2.5 years, starting in 2010, running into 2013. He was the guy on the other side of the table. One of the contradictions in our experience in Afghanistan, we've reviewed a bunch of them, but one of them is that every commanding general who goes out to Afghanistan to fight the war will say publicly, this is not a war that can be won by purely military means. I think it was David Petraeus who commanded the war during 2010, 2011, who said, you can't capture and kill your way out of an industrial strength insurgency, which is what the Taliban had become by the time Tim Hopper went into that green zone. And yet, administration after administration and year after year, we prioritized, we resourced military action, and we barely resourced diplomatic and negotiating strategy. Now, an exception was this negotiation with the Taliban. It was authorized in September of 2010 with a top secret decision directive signed by President Obama the White House formed something called the Conflict Resolution Cell, which was a very small group that was charged with seeing what might be possible. They were highly compartmented, and a lot of people in the government, even at the cabinet level, didn't know that they existed or that they were carrying out this negotiation. And one of the problems with the negotiation was that it was really not a whole of government effort. The Pentagon was still fighting its war, the CIA was fighting its drone war, and this team was trying to negotiate with Taliban. It took a while to figure out if he really was who he said he was, and if he had clout. Eventually, they determined that he did. Certainly, that he was a legitimate representative of the senior Taliban leadership. So the Germans had been talking to him for a while, and they were trying to get the Americans to talk to him. And eventually, a German diplomat, a guy named Michael Steiner, sets up the first meeting with the Americans, and he organizes it at a safe house outside of Munich, near his own hometown. And he tells the Americans, the German intelligence service will get the plane, a private jet. We'll pick Taliban up in Qatar, where he lives. We'll fly him to Munich, and then we'll drive him to the safe house. All you have to do is be there to talk with him. And the Americans agree to this plan. And then about a week or 10 days before the meeting is supposed to take place, the German Michael Steiner comes back to the Americans, and he says, Taliban has expressed a little bit of anxiety that if he comes to this meeting, you're just going to snatch him and send him to Guantanamo. He points out that a number of his friends have gone to meetings with you before and had that happen to them. So the National Security Council takes this to President Obama, and he says, tell Taliban that, President Obama says, tell Taliban that I offer my absolute personal guarantee that if he comes to this meeting, we're just going to talk. We're not going to snatch him. Give him my personal assurance. So the National Security Council tells the German, who tells Taliban. And then the National Security Council staff has a meeting of their own as they're getting ready for this encounter. And they say, you know what? Let's just not tell the CIA about this meeting, or the plane, or the date, or the place, in case there's some kind of automated list of targets and some kind of snatch thing that just kicks into motion automatically. We would hate to embarrass President Obama by actually snatching him after promising that we wouldn't. So you had one part of the government so stovepiped that it couldn't tell another part of the government what it was planning to do about such a critical matter of war and peace. Anyway, the story of the negotiation is a fascinating one. It failed, complicated, but in the end, in the context of our talk, familiar reasons. One was ISI, which really wanted a role in the negotiation. Taliban kept telling the Americans, you think we're ISI's clients because we live there. We have to live there. We don't have any place else to live. That's where our families live. And yes, we have a partnership with them, but we're independent. We're Afghans. We don't want them to be our agents, our lawyers. We can speak for ourselves. So the Americans took that on for a while, but they always knew that if there was going to be anything that was going to come out of this, it had to involve Pakistan, and ISI ended up acting as a kind of, more as a spoiler than as a partner. And the second reason was Hamid Karzai. He was so distrustful of American intentions that he couldn't understand what was really going on here, whether the Americans were doing this as part of their repeated efforts to get him out of his office. There's a funny ending of the negotiation. It's a meeting with John Kerry in Brussels, and the head of the Pakistan Army, who's effectively the head of ISI, comes with the final step in opening a new Taliban political office that will allow even deeper peace negotiations to proceed. And the Pakistani general is carrying a statement that he says is from Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban. And the Americans had actually written the statement because they said, look, if we're going to open this political office, there has to be a statement from Mullah Omar saying, we have no beef with Europe, we have no beef with the United States, we're not terrorists, we don't believe in terrorism. And the Americans had gone back through a bunch of public statements Mullah Omar had made in the past, and they kind of copied and pasted different sentences that he had previously released, and they put it all into one statement. They said he shouldn't have too much of an objection to this, because these are things he's said before. And so the Pakistani general comes with the statement. He says, well, he's made some tweaks. There are a few adjustments, but it's pretty close to what you suggested. The Americans look at it. No, it's acceptable. They're just tweaks. And so the next step moves forward. Well, during the course of the book research, I realized 2.5 years later, we discovered that on the same day that the ISI provided this statement with a few tweaks in Mullah Muhammad Omar's name, Mullah Muhammad Omar died of tuberculosis in a hospital in Karachi on that same day. So he may not have actually authored the tweaks. I'm not sure. It's still going on. In August of 2016, there was a helicopter that went down south of Kabul. It was white, painted to look like a humanitarian relief helicopter. Turned out to have Pakistanis and a Russian pilot on board. The Taliban surrounded it. They got all the Pakistanis and the Russians safely back to Pakistan. Then they destroyed the helicopter. It's an old ISI supply route. The Pakistani put out a statement that it was on its way to Central Asia for repairs, which didn't really make much sense. So they're still doing what they've been doing. We're still doing what we're doing, have been doing, expecting a different result. And so I would just, cautiously forecast that in January 2021, when either the next president of the United States is inaugurated or President Trump is re-inaugurated, this war is still going to be going on. So thank you for listening. Appreciate it.
About the relationship of the ISI, the Taliban, and Afghanistan, and how it progressed from the very beginning stages, which, if I understand you correctly, there was a consideration that they should be working together of some sort.
Say the ISI, the Taliban, and who else?
And the Afghan government. I mean,
Yeah. So yes.
the various parts of the Afghan.
Yes. Well, thank you. I mean, and thanks for your comment. Normally we discourage comments, but those are welcome. It goes to a really important subject, which was why we failed to consolidate the peace in Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban in December of 2001. And there were a number of reasons. We went off to war in Iraq. The Bush administration, at least in the first term, was ideologically skeptical, if not outright opposed to nation building, so we underinvested in Afghanistan. We didn't build up their security forces so they could defend themselves if the Taliban came back, and we didn't invest in reconstruction in proportion to need, not even remotely. But another reason why that peace failed to hold was our hubris about the defeated Taliban. And the episode you're referring to was a CIA officer who was down in Kandahar who tried to organize a political party of ex-Taliban, not senior leaders, but sort of mid-level types who could come into the fold politically, lay down their arms, and participate in the new Afghan political order. And he went back to Washington to present this idea, and Rumsfeld and the White House shot it down. What was the larger picture? The lesson of history is when you win a war, you can hold, if you want to consolidate the peace and rebuild the country, as in Germany, as in Japan, yes, you can hold the leadership of the enemy force accountable. You can try war criminals if you wish. You can have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission of some sort to try to make transparent the abuses on all sides during the war. But you can't hold every enemy foot soldier, sergeant, and lieutenant accountable for the war, because that's just a prescription for a new war. We did that with the Taliban. We rounded up dozens, hundreds. We invited them to meetings. Then we bundled them up, put them in orange jumpsuits, and sent them off to Guantanamo. Or we imprisoned them in Afghan facilities that were even darker places to be held. And we did the same thing in Iraq, by the way. After we overthrew Saddam Hussein, we dissolved the Ba'ath Party and sent the Sunni minority into a disenfranchised state, armed and angry. And why would we be surprised that we had an insurgency a year later? The same thing happened with the Taliban. And so that episode was about trying to develop a blueprint of how you could convert the defeated Taliban into a more stable political element in post-war Afghanistan, post-Taliban Afghanistan.
I've always wondered that if the Taliban was being financed by the opium trade, why didn't we just outbid the Taliban, buy up the opium? It would have reduced their income, and it would have alleviated some of the opium distribution in the United States.
there are recurring arguments in the history about what to do about the Taliban's relationship with the opium. I think it was the British intelligence service that at one point did go in and try to buy up the crop. They spent tens of millions of dollars on it, and then they did an audit, and it didn't really look very good as to where that money had gone. You can imagine that that wouldn't be a very easy policy to enforce. The larger argument was how important was the opium finance to the Taliban's resurgence, and if it was important, then what could be done about it? And a dilemma was that the farmers who grew opium, they didn't benefit from the big international heroin trafficking, but they were the farm gate, farm-to-table farmers. They were almost all in Taliban country, in Kandahar and Helmand, in the same areas that the heaviest fighting took place in. And the military, our military, the Pentagon, said, you do not want to go in there and burn down all their crops. You don't want to spray from the air. You'll look like you're carrying out a chemical weapons attack. There's hardly any literacy in these farming communities. No one understands that this is, some kind of harmless spray. And so if you do that, if you eradicate the crops, you're just going to create a wider and more virulent insurgency. But then the other side of the government, would say, well, this is part of the international drug trafficking menace. Afghanistan at one point was growing enough opium to handle all of the world's supply of heroin, and something has to be done about it. This was never really resolved. It was a recurring fight. It's happening again in the Trump administration. They're making noises about getting back hard on the drug war. The truth is that the Taliban's finance, I think the best evidence is that Taliban's finance is influenced by the opium trade, but not dependent on it. They have other sources of deep financing running into the Gulf, and businesses and sympathizers and lots of others. So it's not a quick fix.
Gentleman in the red.
Wouldn't you say that the failure has to be laid at Obama's feet? Was he just too inexperienced to pull Americans together to have a coherent strategy and execution?
I think this is not, yes. I think that both the Bush and the Obama administrations failed in Afghanistan, and I don't see the Trump administration on a track to success myself yet either. But I do think an honest accounting of the Obama administration has to be a harsh one. The president was inexperienced when he came in, and he was visited in his first week in office by very powerful, politically powerful generals who told him that you must escalate this war now. And they had a timeline because of the election coming up in the summer that was hard to ignore. Essentially, the message was, if you don't increase security, we're not going to be able to stabilize the country in time to hold this election. Apparently, they thought the election was going to be successful. It turned out to be a crisis. But this was when, Biden and Holbrooke, deeply experienced, offered their notes of caution about Vietnam. They didn't like each other, I don't think, very much, and there was not unified, strong advice to the president. I think the president, was in a politically complicated position. The economy was collapsing. His own party was tiring of the war, looking to him for leadership. And he didn't want to squander the agenda that he had for the domestic country on this war. So a course was to take military advice. Now, he didn't just do whatever the generals told him. He went through this intense review and gave the generals less than what they asked for. But it was a compromise, and it's kind of an ugly compromise at the benefit of hindsight. The other thing that I found frustrating is, look, I admire President Obama and understand, I think, some of the enormous successes of his presidency. But the other thing I found frustrating as an Afghan historian was in this negotiation, I gave you a flavor of how secret it was and how kind of tentative it was, and how divided the government's effort was. Think about what the Obama administration achieved in diplomacy. the Iran nuclear accord, whether you think it was a good deal or the worst deal ever made, I mean, that was a really hard deal to land, really hard. They kept Russia on side, they kept China on side, they worked with European allies, they got the Iranians to give up something the Iranians said they would never give up. And it was a whole of government effort. I mean, those negotiations were supported by all the best of what the U.S. has to bring to a hard problem, including spying on the other side, like what are they thinking, what are they saying, what do we need to do, what's the position that will win, including using pressure on the other side to try to get them to see that they had no choice but to make this deal. And this was also an administration that walked past the treacherous politics that had bedeviled every administration before it and changed U.S. policy in Cuba through negotiations, secret negotiations. So why, with so much on the line, with so many American soldiers having gone over there and sacrificed lives or limbs, why didn't we do better at this? Why was this such a Mickey Mouse operation? And it really was, in the context of American power in the world. It was not a full effort. And I can't really explain that. I mean, there was a lot of cynicism about the war in the Obama administration as the years went by, for understandable reasons. It was going poorly, and they were constantly being told by the Pentagon that it was going well. And the White House would write these reviews every December after the big ones, and they would say, and the National Intelligence Council would create intelligence estimates about how the war is going, and the CIA would color these maps, top secret maps, showing that the war hadn't changed in years despite 150,000 international combat troops. And they would tell these truths to the Pentagon, and the Pentagon side would come in and say, you're way too pessimistic. We're making progress, we're making progress. They would get angry at the White House for telling them that the war wasn't going well. And there's a scene, one of those scenes where Doug Lutz just says, hey, don't shoot the messenger. This war is a mess. And so we can see, with the benefit of hindsight, who was right in those arguments, but why not have the courage of conviction then, if that's really your conviction, if you see the evidence moving in that direction? So we could have a discussion about the Bush administration. Also wouldn't be very pretty, but I acknowledge the Obama administration failed to achieve what it set out to achieve in Afghanistan for reasons that have significantly to do with its own failures.
In Ghost Wars, through your current book, you gave us a very detailed, often unreported look into the CIA's role in the lead up to the War on Terror and through the War on Terror. For your research through multiple administrations, how have you seen the role of the intelligence analysts change throughout those 4 decades and multiple administrations in their role in this continuing fight on terror?
Well, there are two kinds of intelligence officers, of course, as it sounds like you know. There's the operations officers who go out and steal secrets or engage in paramilitary action, and then there are the analysts who can access all the secret information in the system as well as open source information and try to provide insights to decision makers about what's really going on. And there's a bunch of both that are characters in the book. The operations officers typically get all the glory, and there's some pretty remarkable characters in this book. But I actually was drawn to some of the analysts that I wrote about here and enjoyed being able to give them a little bit of time on the stage, because what they were really doing, they represented the best of our independent civil service. They were willing to. There's a character who is in charge of these maps at the CIA. They're called the district assessments. And every 6 months, starting in 2007, they unfurled these maps of all 420-ish administrative districts in Afghanistan, and they colored them one color or another based on 25 kinds of data that they'd collected. How many roadside bombings had there been in the last 6 months? Is there evidence of someone attempting assassinations against local government officials? All these indicators. And then they would give them a color: government control, Taliban control, local control, contested. And these maps became hugely popular inside, if you had a top security clearance, top secret security clearance, because everyone would just roll them out on the table and just talk about the war and what's moving around. But what happened was that they didn't really change. They might move around a little bit this way or that way. And the military often became frustrated with these maps because their maps showed, progress. There's a great character who was in the Bush administration. He was advisor to Condoleezza Rice, named Elliot Cohen. He's a public intellectual. He's at Hopkins now, kind of a war strategist. And Condoleezza Rice appoints him to go out to the war and study it in 2007. I think she was pretty much the first one to figure out how bad things were going in the Bush cabinet. And Elliot Cohen goes around, he comes back and he tells her, the problem is the way military careers are shaped by command rotations, it keeps happening over and over again. The new commander comes in and he says, this looks really difficult, really hard. And then after 4 months, he announces, we're really making progress. And at the end of his rotation, when he goes back to the Pentagon, he says, we have achieved irreversible momentum. Then the next person comes in 6 weeks later and says, this looks really, really difficult. And so there's a real challenge to somebody with an MIT degree and a PhD in political science to stand up in that room and say, you're wrong. These are the facts. And they were schooled by their, the Vietnam experience. They were post-Vietnam analysts, and they were willing to say, this is the truth of it. And so there's a bunch of those characters. They come on stage, and you sort of think, okay, someone's going to listen to them. And they lay it all out, and then it's just too hard of a problem to do something differently.
You mentioned in your introduction that there was difficulty in training the Afghan forces. Can you shed a little more light on that?
Well, remember, Afghanistan in 2002 had been at war more or less continuously since the Soviet invasion of 1979, and this is a good note to end on. I write in the introduction, and I'm sure many of you have experience of Afghanistan, but this is not a country of chronic dysfunction or internal violence. It was at peace with itself and its neighbors, very poor but very stable throughout most of the 20th century. And it fell apart not because it collapsed into internal political violence, but because it was invaded by the Soviet Union, which killed at least a tenth of the population, sent millions and millions into exile in Pakistan and Iran, and decimated the country. Then, when the Soviets left, a new civil war developed. The Taliban emerged from that chaos, took control of most of the country, but never ended the war. Then we came in, started another round of war against the Taliban. There was that brief interlude in 2002, and then more war. So this was a broken country, and it was a country whose poverty has to be understood as at the very bottom of the world tables, right? So this is not just a poor country. This is one of the world's 2 or 3 poorest countries in 2002, comparable to Somalia or Chad, Central African Republic, a handful at the very bottom. Life expectancy, maternal mortality, take your pick. And they didn't even have statistics. Literacy was another huge challenge. And so when you contemplate building security forces in a country like that, you cannot approach this with some sort of cookie cutter idea of how you're going to build police and army. The Afghan army did exist through most of the 20th century. It was quite a remarkable institution, about 80,000 soldiers. It was multi-ethnic. It was a good civil service as things in Afghanistan went. But it had been destroyed by all these years of war. So the really tragic years, the 2002 to 2006, they didn't even make an effort. It was outsourced to different countries. There was really, the numbers and the weapons and the money that was spent, they were just picking up AK-47s lying on the side of the road and using them in training. They didn't even have enough weapons for the parade ground some of the time. It was neglect. Now, even if you had decided in the moment of opportunity to try to rebuild that army, and the Afghans wanted it, they kept coming to the Americans and saying, let us rebuild, 60,000, 80,000, let us have our country back. This is what we were before. We just wouldn't spend the money. And even if you had, then the challenges of doing it in that context and to do it differently, to take account of the poverty and to do the investments in literacy and leadership training and to build a non-commissioned officer corps and to have it be something other than just a political patronage machine would have been very hard, but we didn't even try until very late. By the time we tried during the Obama surge, you know, it was really, you were building an airplane in flight. The Afghan security forces today are quite capable, some of them. There's probably 25,000 commandos who have been trained by special forces, international special forces. They're one of the reasons why the war remains a stalemate. They fight their peace, they're very motivated. But the broad picture of the Afghan army and police is one of illiteracy, corruption, and desertion, and high casualties. Very difficult to even replace the people who are lost on the battlefield these days. It's, you know, it doesn't look sustainable, though the resilience of the Afghan people to try to defend their country and the willingness of security forces to fight against the Taliban is remarkable. Thank you. Thanks a lot.